The anti-racism movement in the United States presently has a particular element of belief that they repeat quite often. And I've read this in a particular book that unless you say or do something against racism, if you do nothing or don't do all that you can do, then you are agreeing with those that are racists and that you're assisting them in their work. And I want to show that simply because you don't do something according to their standards of doing something, that you are not guilty because you don't make a show or you don't demonstrate or you don't speak up. We have a few examples in the Bible of people who did not speak up in different situations who are not held guilty. And one example of that is when Elijah, after calling fire down from heaven, he runs away from Jezebel. And finally, God leads him and talks with him when he's in a cave. And one of the things God says to him is that, well, what he has done is that I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and to every mouth that has not kissed him. And also we find previously that Obadiah, the king's assistant, Ahab's assistant, has secretly, against the king's wishes, hidden 100 prophets of God in 2 different caves so Ahab wouldn't find them. Now, these prophets did not speak up against Ahab. And we see here these 7,000 people in Israel who did not bow to Baal. They are not speaking up any place. There's no record of them demonstrating. They aren't marching. They're not petitioning the king at all. They're just being obedient to God, but they're not saying anything to anyone else. It does not mean that they're guilty of Israel's sin, of following Baal, simply because they didn't speak up. We see this also later in the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 9, Ezekiel sees that there are some men that are about to come into Jerusalem in particular and execute God's judgment by putting many to death. And among these men, there is one who is a scribe. He says in Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 2, a certain man clothed in linen with a writing case at his loins. And they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. This is the group of 6 men. Among them is the scribe. And the glory of God, the God of Israel, went up from the cherub on which it had been to the threshold of the temple. And he called to the man clothed in linen, at whose loins was a writing case. The Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city, even through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations which are being committed in its midst. But to the others he said in my hearing, go through the city after him and strike. Do not let your eye have pity, and do not spare. And then in verse 6 we find out that these others that are with the scribe are a picture of the judgment that God will bring upon Jerusalem in putting to death those that don't have this mark, those that don't groan and moan at the abominations of what's going on in the temple. And the abominations in the temple is all the idols that are being worshipped and the idolatry in all the different rooms. There's so many idols, it was difficult to get into the temple. And they walk by, they don't demonstrate. They don't say anything. They groan inside. It hurts them to see what Israel is doing. And though they don't say anything or do anything, they're not guilty for it taking place. In the New Testament, we see the disciples themselves. When Jesus is arrested, when he is tortured by being flogged, and when he's crucified, they say nothing. They run away. And it's just women, and finally the Apostle John, that is there watching, but they say nothing. They do nothing to stop this. They don't say anything to the leaders, nothing to the Romans. And they're not guilty because Jesus was put to death. Simply because they said nothing does not make them guilty. And this idea that unless you say something, you're guilty is a wrong idea. In the book I read, they were talking about Billy Graham. And the writer was saying that since Billy Graham never marched with Martin Luther King, therefore Billy Graham is guilty of supporting racism. That is a horrible idea and conclusion. Horrible idea. So when people tell you that you are guilty if you do not participate, it is not true. God does not hold you guilty because you say nothing or don't participate in demonstrations. You're not guilty for racism because you don't march. You're not guilty for racism because you're not saying it out vocally to others or putting others in their place because they may have other opinions. No, you're not held guilty because of that. That is a misnomer, and that's what I wanted to say. Now, Christians, be careful. That if that principle is true, that you're guilty if you say nothing, then that means there's all kinds of guilt upon you for all kinds of things that you have said nothing to. That principle does not exist. It's made up. It's not true. So don't believe it. That's the truth. And this is Jim Brown.